Evening to all of you. I'm happy to see all of you again, and I'm happy we have a new guest and will speak to us tonight. It's Kath Bransby, and we are very much happy. You have the topic well-being and health and resilience, and so far you prove that you have resilience. We heard about your COVID and that you are able to talk to us tonight. That is very, very nice. We are happy you can make it tonight. So this is the topic, Schools for Wellbeing, Mental Health and Resilience. And Kath Bransby, she's from England, and as we see, she teaches right now at Sheffield, Hallam University. Her focus is education, early childhood education, and this is her upbringing too. She has been a teacher for early childhood education for more than 14 years, and since 2018, she is teaching at Sheffield Hallam University. So we are very happy to have you here with us, and please start your talk.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm going to start with a couple of warnings. So first of all, I'm a native English speaker, and I'm very aware that I'm going to cram about probably 8 to 12 hours of material into 50 minutes, hopefully. So if I start to go very, very quickly and become unintelligible, please just type something in the chat and let me know that I need to slow down. My second warning is that because I'm bringing an awful lot of stuff, cramming an awful lot of stuff into this presentation, I'm not going to do the work for you of connecting this work, this information, to Steiner education, to anthroposophy, to Steiner's work. I'm going to leave that for you to do. I'm going to very much give you an introduction to this work and allow you to make those connections yourself. So I'm going to share my screen like this, and then I can make a start. Okay, so the next warning that I'm going to give you is that some of the content in this session is quite difficult to hear, particularly for anyone who's ever experienced some sort of trauma in their own childhood. So please, if you're struggling, if the stuff that I'm talking about gets very difficult for you, please take a break, please leave the room, please make yourself a cup of tea or go for a walk or whatever coping strategies work for you. And if you need additional support, there's a couple of UK organisations here, but if you need additional support, please do go and find that for yourself wherever you are. So, in the UK, we have a mental health crisis in the UK. 1 in 6 of our children have a diagnosable mental health problem. More than 1 in 4 of our young women have a diagnosable mental health problem. And it's so widespread that in England, we now have an infant mental health week where we focus on we promote the mental health of children under the age of 3. So we're talking about the whole spread of childhood. In terms of the help that's available for children, CAMS is our Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services, the government mental health services. So when children are referred into those mental health services, between 18 and 75% of them, depending on where you live, are not seen at all by anybody. They're discharged without even an assessment. When they are assessed, it takes about 13 weeks for them to begin treatment. Nearly half of the children who are referred, who are accepted by CAMS, are only seen once and then they're discharged. And on average, the gap between children and young people first becoming unwell and then actually getting some help, that average gap is 10 years. So it's incredibly important that we are aware of this, aware of the impact that this is going to have on our schools and on our children. We're actually not aware yet of what the impact is going to be of the pandemic, of the children who had their infancy in lockdown, the impact of what that has done to our children and young people over time. We're only just starting to see the beginnings of those impacts. We also, certainly in the UK, have a mental health crisis within the teaching profession. So 77% of teachers have experienced symptoms of poor mental health due to their work. This is teachers across the mainstream, and most of the data will have come from the mainstream. But 72% of teachers in the UK are stressed. 42% of teachers think that the organisation's culture, so the school culture, has a negative impact on their well-being. And over half of teachers have considered leaving education altogether in the last 2 years because of pressures on their mental health. So this work is incredibly important. Children seem to have lower and lower levels of resilience. This work has to be an area of focus for our schools, and there's an awful lot of work to do. So as I say, I'm going to be cramming a huge amount into this, and in 50 minutes, I can only give you a very, very short introduction to a tiny aspect of this work. So what I'm going to look at with you today is some of the neuroscience, some of the latest research. And as I say, it's a very small slice, and I'm hoping it will inspire you to go and find out some more. So I'm going to ask you to do something. I'm going to ask you to imagine. So I'm going to ask you to imagine that you have booked a holiday of a lifetime. I'm going to ask you to imagine that you've packed your suitcases. You're incredibly excited about where you're going. The taxi has come to take you to the airport very, very early in the morning. You've jumped into the taxi with all your bags. There's been quite a bit of traffic getting to the airport. It's a little bit stressful. You walk through the doors of the airport and you just make it to the desk in time to check in for your flight. And you put your bags on the scales, and you're all ready to go. And you open your bag, your handbag, and there are no passports and no tickets. I really love doing this with Waldorf teachers because their imaginations are so powerful that they really get the impact of that. Okay, so I'm going to put you into breakout rooms for a moment. I'll just stop my share. So we're going to go into breakout rooms, and I would like you to talk just for a couple of minutes about two things. I want you to say, when you have that moment where you open your bag and there's no passport, and there's no tickets, what are the physical sensations in your body? Physically, where do you feel that? What happens to you physically? And the second thing I want you to talk about is, how do you behave? What do you do next? Okay, so if we could open the breakout rooms, and it's 39 minutes past on my clock. I'm going to bring you back together at 43 minutes past, so you will only have 3 or 4 minutes to talk about it. So it's physical effects and your behaviour. Okay, thanks everybody. I can see lots of smiles. There's usually somebody in every group who's had that actual experience, and it still makes me, even when I give you that picture, it still makes my stomach drop and makes me feel cold and all of those kind of physical things. So I'd like you, if you can find your reactions button and I'm going to give you a list of things, behaviours. So I'd like you to use one of your reactions buttons to tell me which one of these you are. So you can either put your hand up or do a clap or whatever. Hands up, all of those people who are shouters and swearers. Or you can just raise a hand, but it's good. Yep, shouters and swearers, brilliant. Okay, hands up, all of those people who dissolve into a puddle of tears in a corner. Yep, some of those. Hands up, all the shamers and blamers, where it's somebody else's fault. Okay. My favourite one is when I do this with my undergraduate students, there's always at least half of them, their response is, I would phone my dad.
Sweet.
That's what they would do first thing. Who are the tip your bag upside down and start going through everything as quickly as possible? Yep. And have we got any laser focused problem solvers who go straight into problem solving mode? How can I get to the tickets? When's the next flight? What am I going to do now? Yep. Okay. Brilliant. Have we got any fainters? I'm married to a fainter. Fainters and vomiters, yeah, always fun. Okay. So I'm just going to share my screen again. And I'm going to take you through a little bit of the neuroscience behind those responses and those reactions and what that means for us. So this is a model of the brain, a model called the triune brain. It was created by somebody called Paul MacLean in the 1960s. And he created a hugely complex theory around this kind of basic model of the brain. Most of that theory has been debunked, and this is a very, very simplistic way of looking at the structure of the brain. But it is basically accurate, and it is quite a helpful way of thinking about our brains. So this structure is says that the brain is in 3 parts, always helpful. So the brown part, the brainstem and the cerebellum, is known as the reptilian brain or the primitive brain. It's the oldest bit of our brain in kind of evolutionary terms, or the most primitive bit of our brain, and it controls our vital functions. So heart rate, breathing, body temperature, and balance. It's very reliable, this part of our brain, but it tends to be quite rigid and quite compulsive. The next bit of our brain is called the limbic system, and you start to see this part of the brain, these brain structures in mammals, and the limbic system can record memories of behaviours that produce agreeable or disagreeable experiences. So the limbic system is responsible for what we call emotions in human beings. So the main structures there are the hippocampus, the amygdala, the hypothalamus. The next part of the brain is the neocortex, and the neocortex it gained more importance in primates, and with the human brain, we have these 2 huge cerebral hemispheres that play a really dominant role in our brains, and those cerebral hemispheres, our neocortex, are responsible for the development of language, of abstract thought, of imagination, of consciousness. And the neocortex is incredibly flexible. It has almost infinite learning abilities. Okay, so what you can do is you can, to help you remember this model of the brain, you can do this with your hand. So I'd like you all to put your hand up. I'll use my other hand because it's in the clearer space. See if you can get all my fingers. So this is our primitive brain. Our reptilian brain is our brainstem and the cerebellum here. Our limbic system sits in the middle, our emotional brain in the middle, and our neocortex, our thinking brain, is wrapped around the whole thing. So that's a really helpful way to remember that bit of brain structure. So part of our limbic system, part of our emotional brain, is this little system called the amygdala, and the amygdala is like the alarm within our brain. The amygdala triggers the hypothalamus, and the amygdala and the hypothalamus together are like the control center of what we call the autonomic nervous system. So the amygdala is an alarm. It's triggered by something that we think might be dangerous. And that triggers the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus triggers the adrenal glands, which produce adrenaline or epinephrine. And that's the basis of our autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system controls many different things. But in terms of our response to danger or our response to stress, in terms of that amygdala alarm going off, it controls our breathing, our blood pressure, our heart rate, and it controls the dilation and the constriction of our bronchioles, so within our lungs. So the autonomic nervous system it's actually 2 halves of the same system. First, we have the sympathetic nervous system, and that's like the accelerator of the gas pedal of the autonomic nervous system. So when the amygdala is triggered and our adrenal glands are triggered, adrenaline goes into the blood, our heart rate goes up, our heart beats faster, our blood pressure goes up, our breathing becomes rapid, our lungs expand, we get extra oxygen to the brain, and nutrients are released into our bloodstream to give our muscles the energy that we need. And those changes are really, really rapid, we're not conscious of them. And that response, that subconscious response, is often called the fight or flight response. The fight or flight response is, there are actually 4 types of response. The most widely known are flight and fight. So our fight response is we're going to attack the danger. Our flight is we're going to run away from the danger. Freeze is where we try and hide from the danger. And fawn is where we try and convince the danger not to be dangerous. So you try and convince the tiger not to eat you. So when we look at that autonomic nervous system and that sympathetic nervous system response to that potential danger, that stressor, you can see how those physical changes have an impact on the way that your body feels in that stressful situation. So your heart rate goes up, your heart starts to pound, you start to breathe quickly. The blood can either rush to your face and you get very flushed and very hot, or the blood can drain away from your face, ready to into your limbs, so that you can run away or fight whatever's coming next and make you feel very lightheaded. We take all of the blood supply from the bits of our bodies that we don't need. So from your digestive system, for example, which is that stomach dropping sensation, where you have that realization that something's gone wrong, danger, and your stomach drops. We can shake because all of the energy is going into our muscles. All of those physical responses have a physical feeling within our bodies. So I'm going to ask you to do another little group task very quickly. I'm going to have to be quick. In fact, I won't send you into breakout rooms for this. I'd like you to just have a look at these and have a think about these behaviours and whether these behaviours would be a fight response, a flight response, a freeze response, or a fawn response. I'll just give you a moment to have a look. So fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Okay, so I'm going to give you the answers and point out a whole load of other behaviours as well. These are some fight, flight, freeze, and fawn behaviours. And I'd just like you to take a moment to reflect on whether any of these behaviours are familiar to you. You could put these in the chat if you want to as well. Are these any of these behaviours that you have noticed in yourself in stressful situations or dangerous situations? But also, are any of these behaviours things that you have noticed in children in the classroom? Quite often in schools, I've often heard this language of choices. I hear adults talking to children about choices in terms of their behaviour. So teachers talking to children about their behaviour and saying, now, do you think it was a good choice when you did that? Do you think it was a good choice to hit your friend? Do you think it was a good choice to shout at the teacher? Do you think it was a good choice to not do your work? What's really important when we think about these physical responses and these behaviours that come as a part of this response is that these behaviours are not a choice, they're a response. That doesn't mean that we accept these behaviours, that we say, well, never mind, they were just, they were stressed, so it's fine, it doesn't matter if you hit somebody. It's that we just have to understand that behaviours like this are a response to an experience. They're not it's not a judgment on a child's character. These behaviours are a response that's driven by hormonal and physical changes in the brain and the body. And when we can bear that in mind, it means that we can respond with empathy and with curiosity, and we can help children to develop better coping strategies for these responses. If you think back to your response to losing your wallet and your passport in the airport, as an adult, with your fully engaged prefrontal cortex, your thinking brain, with all of your language, all of your vocabulary that you can use to explain your emotions and your feelings, with your really well-developed self-regulation and self-control, you didn't actually have a huge amount of choice about how you behaved. So we have to, how can we expect our children to do any better than us if they're in stressful situations? If we think about this hand model of the brain, when we're under stress, we quite literally flip our lid. We lose the connection between the thinking part of our brain and that emotional, primitive, reactive part of our brain. That primeval part of our brain takes over, and we quite literally lose our minds. So it can look something like this. Okay, so what do we do? How do we work with children who are in this state of stress? How can we bring that thinking brain back into connection? So once the stress response has been triggered, when that sympathetic nervous system, that accelerator, that gas pedal has kicked in, what do we do if a child is in that state of flight, fight, freeze or fawn? The second part of the autonomic nervous system is called the parasympathetic nervous system, and that acts like the brake. So the parasympathetic nervous system takes experiences from takes information from our sensory experiences, and it communicates to the brain that we're now safe. So we can activate the parasympathetic nervous system and create feelings of safety in a number of different ways. So we can breathe slowly. If we can regain control of our breath, that makes us feel safer. If we're moving slowly, if we don't need to run anymore, then our body is telling us that we are safer. Safe touch, safe and comfortable touch can make us help us to feel safe. Animals in particular. Eating and drinking. It's well known in the UK, certainly, if you have a bit of a shock, if you do something stressful, the first thing you have is a sugary cup of tea. Empathetic response from another person, activating that connection with another person is really important. And then when we've regulated ourselves, we can bring ourselves back into connection with rational thought, with our thinking brains, and then gain control of ourselves. When children are very young, they haven't developed the neural connections to that thinking brain yet. So that primitive brain can be in the driving seat most of the time. Babies and toddlers don't have really well-developed access to that neocortex. That is, they have all of the brain cells, but the connections between those brain cells haven't yet been made. That's the learning process. And so babies and toddlers can't be reasoned with or be reasonable when they're dysregulated. So, you know, when they don't get what they want, when their sandwich is the wrong shape, or when their cup is the wrong colour, or, you know, when you put their wellies on for them or you don't put their wellies on for them, those emotions for those young children are enormous, and they're not manageable for the baby, for the infant, by themselves. And so the adult regulates the child. We regulate them. We hug and we pat and we bounce and we carry them and we breathe with them and we talk. And as adults, when we're in that situation, as an early years teacher particularly, it's very difficult for us to stay in our own thinking brains. It's very dysregulating for adults to be confronted with this type of emotion. It's really difficult to keep that engaged. So our regulation is incredibly important, our own self-regulation. But regulation is something that we learn how to do through being in relationship with emotionally available adults. First of all, we are regulated by the adults in our lives. Then we regulate alongside adults. We're helped to regulate ourselves. And only then eventually will we be able to become able to regulate ourselves independently. Anyone with teenagers, we know that this is a process. It's a long process. And it's a process that's really dependent on a child having those adults around them who can regulate for them, first of all, then co-regulate with them so that they can develop that self-regulation. When we are those emotionally available adults, when we regulate children and then co-regulate with them, when we help them to wrap language around their experiences, when we're consistently emotionally responsive to children, then their thinking brain, their neocortex, develops all of those neural connections with their feeling brain, their limbic brain. And that thinking brain soothes the primitive part of the brain that sparks those fight, flight, freeze and fawn behaviours. So children they develop narratives that help them when they're distressed. They develop strategies and ways of regulating themselves. And that's what we call resilience. For children who haven't had those experiences, you may well need to go back several stages. So you may have a teenager who has never been regulated for or regulated with in any kind of consistent way. And you may have to go back a stage and go through that whole process with them. Just very quickly, I also want to point out that not all stress is bad. There is a big difference between eustress and distress. So eustress is positive stress. And there are lots of ways that we have positive stress in our lives, but positive stress gives us, it's about excitement, it gives us motivation, it helps us to work towards goals. When we have something a little bit stressful and we overcome that and succeed, that gives us a sense of achievement and fulfillment. It builds our confidence, and facing stress and managing it is how we become more resilient. So in our practice, we want to make sure that children do have positive stress. We want to try and mitigate distress. So the stress that they do experience, if it is serious, we want it to be temporary. We want it to be buffered. We want to provide children with supportive relationships that help them to deal with stress so that it's tolerable. We learn resilience by living with positive stress. But if we spend too much time experiencing stress, too much time activating that fight, flight, freeze and fawn response, then the stress becomes toxic. So if you remember back to those sensations that you had in the airport, and how the amygdala triggers the hypothalamus, the adrenaline floods into the bloodstream and has all of these effects on your body. After that initial surge of adrenaline, the brain has two options. If the brain no longer perceives any danger, then the parasympathetic nervous system kicks in and everything calms down. But if the brain still perceives that there is danger, then a new mechanism kicks in. It's called the HPA axis, hypothalamus, pituitary and adrenal axis. So if the tiger's still there, if we're still sensing the danger, the hypothalamus sends hormonal signals to the pituitary glands. The pituitary sends hormonal signals to the adrenal glands on the kidneys. And then we get a different hormone called cortisol. So our adrenal glands release this different hormone called cortisol. Cortisol is a really useful hormone. Cortisol allows us to continue to respond to danger. So if we're running away from the tiger, we don't fall over after 50 meters because we're exhausted. Cortisol is what allows us to continue to keep going. So it has a number of effects. It increases the amount of sugar in our bloodstream so that we have the energy to keep going. It enhances the brain's use of glucose. So it gives us that laser focus. It allows us to think. It shuts down all the non-essential functions. So our digestive system, our reproductive system, everything to do with growth, it shuts all of that down and diverts all the energy to the most important things at the time. And it also helps us to learn about danger and mood and motivation and fear. So in dangerous situations, cortisol is incredibly useful. As long as we can get to the point where the body feels safe and we can turn it off again. Unfortunately, cortisol is also a poison. So when the body has repeatedly been in situations where it perceives danger, where the brain has been repeatedly flooded with cortisol, that has really negative effects. And our brains, we end up with what's called chronic or toxic stress. And that causes a whole range of issues. Things like anxiety and depression seem sort of fairly logical. But it's things like that repeated reduction of blood to the digestive system causes significant damage, and we can end up with digestive problems. We hold all of that stress and tension in our muscles. That repeated readiness for fight or flight causes tension and pain and headaches. The repeated additional flow of blood to the brain also can cause headaches. The adrenal surges and the repeated dilation of the blood vessels causes damage, and that results in all sorts of cardiac problems. We can struggle to sleep. Our brains are too alert to allow us into healthy sleep, and that has an impact on our memory and our concentration. And cortisol increases your appetite. So stress makes you fat because cortisol is telling our bodies that we need more and more very easily accessible fuel that we can use to maintain this state of increased awareness and readiness. So it makes us crave very easily accessible calories, so carbohydrates and sugars and fats. And it also increases the storage of any unused nutrients as fat. So it has a huge impact on our bodies. So what's the impact of toxic stress in childhood? This is Dr. Vincent Felitti. He is one of the seminal researchers into toxic or chronic stress in childhood and its impact on later life. So Dr. Felitti was a doctor in San Diego in the 1990s, and he was running a weight loss clinic. And what he noticed was that there were a high number of patients who were dropping out of treatment and not being successful in losing weight. And he began to wonder why. Instead of just kind of assuming it was a lack of willpower, he started carrying out interviews with the patients who dropped out. And he noticed that there was a pattern that all of these patients had faced particular types of adversity in childhood. They'd faced physical or emotional abuse or neglect, or what he referred to as household dysfunction. And he went on to call these experiences adverse childhood experiences. Dr. Felitti then worked with a number of colleagues to carry out what the original ACEs study, Adverse Childhood Experiences study, which is the reference at the bottom. And it was a huge piece of research, population level study. And what the research found was that there was an absolutely undeniable correlation, and then therefore a very strong evidence for causation between adverse childhood experiences and a huge range of negative outcomes across a real range of different aspects of adult life. So I'm just going to flash up a couple of the results, but it's an entire book of graphs like this, basically. So these graphs show the impact of the number of ACEs that you've had, adverse childhood experiences. These ones are on common mental health issues, so anxiety and depression, and the percentage of people who attempt to take their own life. And you can see really clearly here that as the number of adverse childhood experiences go up, so does the incidence, the risk of anxiety and depression, the risk of people being in such high levels of mental distress that they attempt to take their own life. And there is a particularly noticeable impact across the whole study at 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. So these graphs show how as the ACE score rises, so does the incidence of addiction or substance misuse, whether that's smoking or alcohol dependence or intravenous drug use. And there are some really complex impacts. So there's an impact on sexual behaviour. So children with more ACEs are more likely to start having sex earlier in their teens. They're also more likely to become pregnant or become a father at a much earlier age. High ACE scores have a correlation with greater health risks. So people with higher ACE scores are more likely to suffer with lung disease and with liver disease, things like that. So the mechanism this is a model that's been developed to explain the mechanism, the connection between how these adverse childhood experiences become negative life outcomes. So the idea is that the childhood experiences disrupt a child's neurodevelopment. That leads to social, emotional, and cognitive impairments of some kind, lagging skills, if anybody's interested in Ross Green. Those impairments, those lagging skills mean that people are much more likely to adopt health risk behaviours. They're therefore much more likely to suffer from disease, disability, or a whole host of social problems. And ultimately, that means that they're likely to die younger. So, it's really important to remember that Dr. Feliti's research was done on middle-class families, on families without the complicating factors of and stresses of poverty. And it's very easy for us to think that it's unusual for children, particularly children in the kinds of families that access Waldorf education typically. It's easy for us to think that you know, these deeply traumatic experiences don't happen to our children. So it's not something we need to worry about. I'm just going to run through some statistics with you for the UK population, just so you can get some idea of really how common it is for children and their families to have these kinds of traumatic experiences. So the way that this data is collected is through large-scale surveys asking adults about their childhoods. It's considered to be really reliable data. It's called the National Crime Survey of England and Wales. But 1 in 5 adults reports having experienced at least one form of child abuse, whether that's emotional abuse, physical, sexual, or witnessing domestic violence, before the age of 16. So 1 in 5 adults reports that in the UK. It's 1 in 14 adults reports some form of sexual abuse before the age of 16. Domestic abuse, the definition of domestic abuse is much wider than just the domestic violence that was considered in the original ACEs questionnaire. But there's a real argument for including the whole of domestic abuse, not just physical violence. And the statistics around domestic abuse are hugely shocking. In the UK, 1 in 4 women will suffer domestic abuse at some point in their lives. Every year, nearly 2 million people in the UK from our 70 million population, 60 million, 70 million population, suffer some form of domestic abuse. The majority are female, but there's a large number of male victims as well. Pregnancy is a trigger. So over 1/3 of domestic violence either starts or gets worse when a woman's pregnant. And that means that children are therefore at risk, because that is their very existence is a trigger for domestic abuse. So the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, that's the NSPCC, their statistics show that 1 in 5 children witness domestic abuse at some point in their lives. And 62% of children who are living in a household where domestic abuse happens are directly harmed by the perpetrator. But actually, the impact of witnessing domestic abuse is exactly the same as if that abuse happens directly to you. We have a huge number of children in England and Wales who are separated from one of their parents by imprisonment. Criminal behaviour is one of the original ACEs questionnaire determiners. About 4,500 of these children are separated from their mother, but over 100,000 are separated from their father. So most of us would recognise those kinds of experiences that I've just described as being traumatic. And it's very easy for us to think of trauma as that high-end, catastrophic events, fires, car accidents, natural disasters, war, terrorism, abuse. But trauma exists on a continuum, and it's really helpful if we widen our understanding of what may be considered a traumatic experience for children. This definition of trauma, I think, is really useful. And when we think about trauma, it's not actually the event itself that is traumatic. Trauma is the body's response to the way that a person experiences something. Trauma is actually about what happens after the event. Trauma is about, is this something that I can make sense of? So trauma is a response to any event that is encountered as out of control, frightening, that disconnects us from a sense of resourcefulness, safety, coping, or love. And so the Adverse Childhood Experiences questionnaire, what counts as an adverse childhood experience, is much, much wider than those very, the things that are easy to understand as trauma. So divorce or separation is considered to be an adverse childhood experience, and around 30% of children in the UK don't live with both of their parents. Living in a household where there is substance misuse is considered to be a trauma. And we're not very good in the UK at collecting this data. There's no direct data collection. But in the US, it's thought that it's about 1 in 8 children lives with a parent who recurrently uses alcohol or other drugs in a way that impairs them significantly. Parents are often dealing with their own issues, and that makes it so much harder for them to provide that consistent, steady, regulated presence that children need. In the UK, 1 in 4 people are experiencing a mental health problem in any one year. We have 1 in 6 people experiencing common mental health problems in any given week. 1 in 5 people have had suicidal thoughts at some point. 1 in 14 people self-harm, and 1 in 15 people attempt suicide. And approximately 68% of these people are women. 68% of women with these problems and 57% of men with these problems are parents. And that has an impact on children. So if we think, I just very quickly want to divert into salutogenesis, because I think salutogenesis is a concept that in Waldorf education we're very familiar with. This idea that if our experiences are meaningful, comprehensible, and manageable, that gives us a sense of coherence. And that sense of coherence is what helps us to build resilience. If you look at the sense of coherence and that definition of trauma, we can see that they are in direct opposition. They are the absolute opposite to each other. So where sense of coherence builds resilience, any experiences that we have that are out of control, where children experience it as out of control, not manageable, as frightening, so not comprehensible, and as something that disconnects us from resourcefulness, safety, coping, and love. Not meaningful, not manageable, not comprehensible. We can see how the two sides of this coin relate to one another. So what's the impact of adverse childhood experiences? For children, if they experience the world as not manageable, not meaningful, and not comprehensible, then they can have cortisol poisoning. They can suffer from chronic stress. Their amygdala, that alarm system, becomes so sensitive that the slightest thing can trigger that powerful stress response for them. So everything is perceived as a threat, and the slightest little thing can fling them into that fight, flight, freeze or fawn behaviour. In the classroom, children with high numbers of ACEs are far more at risk of having learning difficulties. They're less likely to achieve well. They're more likely to have poor attendance. They're more likely to exhibit violent behaviour. They're far more likely to have a diagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or some kind of conduct disorder or behaviour. This next statistic is so incredibly convincing for me. 97% of children with no adverse childhood experiences have no learning problems. So if you don't have adverse childhood experiences, the chances are that you will succeed really well at school. So when you turn that around, it gives you some idea of the impact. So this all sounds like really bad news. There are high numbers of children with adverse childhood experiences. Those adverse experiences can have a significant and lasting impact on children's education, on their adult life. But the really good news is that there is a huge amount that we can do. So around 3 out of 4 people who experience 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, that magic number, about 75% of people with high numbers of ACEs do not develop any negative outcomes. So there's a really wide body of research that says that if we can implement protective factors, if we can work out what it is that we can do to ensure that children don't have these negative outcomes, we can break the connection between the adverse childhood experiences and the consequences of those. So the first thing that we can do is what in the UK we call safeguarding, and safeguarding has a bit of a bad name in the UK. It's often seen as something that's imposed upon us by the government, and that it's bureaucratic, that it doesn't really apply to us. But the basic principle of safeguarding is that anybody who is working in education and care has a legal and an ethical duty to protect the welfare of the children that they work with. They have a legal and ethical duty to ensure that children are safe so that we can interrupt those adverse childhood experiences. And children spend a lot of time with us. In schools, we are very well placed to be able to identify, to recognise where there might be a potential issue, and therefore to do something about it. So every adult working in a school has a vital role to play in ensuring that all children can live free from abuse and from neglect. That's what safeguarding is about, and it's hugely important. There are lots of preventative measures that we do really well in our schools, and that we can focus on and put in place. So time spent outside, time spent in nature is a hugely protective factor for mental health and well-being. Developing emotional intelligence is incredibly important. That is about having the language to talk about our experiences, to be able to self-regulate, to be able to make sense of the difficult things that happen to us. And we make sense of things through language. Maintaining that sense of coherence, so being presented in our school lives with things that are manageable, meaningful and comprehensible. And creating a sense of belonging, so creating strong communities where children feel like they belong. In 2006, a large team of paediatricians and psychologists and health advocates developed a questionnaire based on 40 years of research into resilience, how children develop resilience. What factors protect children against the impact of adverse childhood experiences? So these are phrased as questions. They're not meant to be asked of children. They are questions that they're statements that aim to promote reflection and conversation on the kinds of experiences that protect people. So the more of these statements that apply to a child, the more of these things that a child can say about themselves, the more resilient they're likely to be. So obviously these are things that we as adults in schools, these are things that we can do to develop children's resilience, to increase the protective factors. So there are 14 statements. I'm not going to read them out loud to you. And I know we're running short of time. So these are on the slides that are on the PDF. I'll flick through them very quickly for you. Okay. I believe that life is what you make it. That's that's the really significant one for me. But the most important protective factor is that children have access to an emotionally available adult. So for most children, that adult is going to be a parent, but it doesn't have to be. Someone at school can make that difference. So I'm just going to show you to finish. I'm just going to show you a short video about a footballer Ian Wright. And the teacher who was a huge protective factor in his life. Ian Wright had a large numbers of adverse childhood experiences, but he had one teacher called Mr. Pigden, who was that emotionally available adult. You may need a tissue. It's a little bit of a tearjerker, this one. So I apologise.
I've got two older brothers and a younger sister. Grew up in Brockley, South East London, Crofton Park. Dad left very early. Dad left when I was about 18 months. And it was one of those where I saw him in like 10-year spells kind of thing. And my stepdad came in, must have been about 5 or something, 6. That's where I remember him from. And he wasn't a nice fella. It was pretty much, it was rough when I was younger. Being the youngest boy, you know what I mean? I was a little bit, I wouldn't say I was bad, but I was scally. I was very extrovert from a young age. I'm very confident. And it rubbed people up the wrong way, especially my stepdad. He didn't like me at all. My mum she was an alcoholic. My mum was an alcoholic. She didn't even know it. And it's only when I got to Arsenal and stuff like that, and I went on the steps with Paul Merson one time, and I realised, and it was really, it was one of those where like, all of a sudden I realised my mum's an alcoholic. She was quite abusive alcoholic as well, in respects of always abusive, very abusive towards me. I can't remember being hugged much by my mum. You know what I mean? You think back to moments and stuff. And even when I used to go to the football trials and trying to get into the clubs, I remember when I used to go to trials, my mum used to say, another thing I didn't understand till I got older, many are called and few are chosen, you're wasting your time, kind of thing. And so I really couldn't wait to get out of the house. The first real positive male in my life is a teacher called Mr. Pigden. And it's funny because like on the Twitter right now, the people are banding around this show what I've done. Little help from my friends that I've done with ITV, building a venture playground for the kids over this disabled kids over in North London. And I thought that this teacher, Mr. Pigden, the words I got from the people was that he died. And I was, you know what I mean, at the time I was like, oh, Jesus, gutted, because he was somebody who would sit me down, he would talk to me, when I had he used to call it the EBGBs, because I would get angry from being like this to full-on rage, and he would sit me down, and he would talk to me, and explain to me, you know what I mean, how to communicate. I was like a little, like Tarzan or something. So then he took me out of the class, he literally taught me to read and write properly himself. He turned me into a monitor. So I would go around with the school register, to collect the registers up. I would be the milk monitor guy. You know what I mean? I'd take messages to the teachers. And then once he realized I could play football and everything, he started to teach me how to play football and how you have to pass to other people, and why you have to pass to other people, and why you have to communicate nicely, and why you have to give people encouragement.
Ian's still the highest scoring striker ever to play for Arsenal, and he owes a lot to the man who first taught him to kick a ball, his old school teacher, Sid Pigden.
As I haven't seen him for, 23, 24 years, and so he would now be expecting me to be 6 feet under, I would think. I don't actually think, he probably won't recognise me because he won't believe it's me. Hello, Ian. Long time no see.
Mr. Pigden, you're alive.
I'm alive, he says. How are you doing?
I can't believe it. Someone said you was dead.
And as you see, I'm very much in, and I'm so glad you've done so well with yourself.
He was so supportive all the time. He kind of like had me as his kind of like special guy. I don't know what to say. I can't believe it. I can't. And I literally started to cry like I was like, I don't know, a 5, 6-year-old, uncontrollable crying because of how happy I was to see him. And, you know, it's when I watched it, that is when I realized how much of an effect that man had on my life, and how important it is to have a positive male figure in your life. I grew up on a...
Okay. I apologise, I've gone over time. I knew it was a lot to squeeze in, but there's a lot to say. And as I say, this is only a very, very tiny slice of some of the work and the research that's being done in this area. And I hope that you can take it back with you and start to look into it and how this applies in your classroom and in your schools. I've sent a PDF of the slides to Laura, so that will be uploaded. And at the end, there's several slides full of reading and resources and research that you can go and have a look at. So yeah, I would encourage you to do so. Any questions?
May I have a question?
Of course.
I guess it was in the mid-80s that in the UK there was a publication by a Sue Palmer. She
Yes.
wrote the book Toxic Childhood.
Yes.
And quite some researchers you showed us, she brought already in that time. So my question is, what has developed since then? Because these are 20, 30, 35 years in between. That's one question. And the other question I have is, is there research about the stress factors that can happen by the way we teach? I guess that's on the continent important factor of possible stress in children and students about modern methods of education, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so 2 questions: Sue Palmer and toxic childhood. Yes, absolutely. And this stuff has been around for a long time. I think what we're understanding better now are some of the neurological mechanisms that sit behind it. I do this as a whole day training for schools, and one of the things we look at is emotional regulation and the links between language and emotion, and the way. Now, what I find really interesting is that I found some of Steiner's work that talks about exactly this. So we've known about it forever. Well, not forever, but we've certainly known about Steiner knew about it 100 years ago. But what we know now is that are the mechanisms, and we have some of the evidence that really strongly supports that as an argument. Which is really helpful. And in terms of teaching in the classrooms, yes, absolutely. There's more research in terms of what Sue was talking about in terms of toxic childhood. We've got a really good research summary on the impact of screen time, on mental health, all of that kind of thing. Whether governments are interested in looking at some of that research is a slightly different question.
Yeah.
But in the UK, we now have this knowledge-based curriculum that I haven't got time to go into the whole E.D. Hirsch thing, but it's this idea that cultural capital is important, that what education is about is for people to remember things, for children to remember more stuff. And that's what's valuable, that's currency. And the research into the impact of that on British children is just starting, because we've had that curriculum for 12 years now. And you can see in the mental health statistics in British schools already, you can see the impact. So yeah, it's definitely.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's very interesting and wonderful what you presented. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I have a similar question to what Christoph said. I wonder if there is, what you described is that there are so many cases of children who are under stress, and you already, and you said sometimes it takes 10 years till it becomes something you deal with and take care of. And so in my talk, I mentioned a similar question I had, that we do so much of evaluation and testing in school, and we always test the outcome of the students. So this is the normal, like the PISA way doing it. So how's the outcome? But as you put it, it's so important for the children to have some kind of a healthy trust in themselves, and they feel well, and they like to go to school. And my question is there any official testing of that going on? How do children actually feel at school? Are they happy to go there? Do they feel relaxed? Do they like their teachers? And so on. And because this could be some kind not only to see the moment it's too late, so you have to take care of children who already have problems, but to see how is the school working for them, how is their well-being at school right now. Is there any testing officially done in England, maybe, or other countries?
We have in England we have I think it's called the National Happiness Survey, Children's Happiness. I can't remember the name of the study, but we do have a national measurement of that, but it's not linked to schools. It's more general than just what's this like in schools. There are several projects that are measuring happiness or measuring well-being in schools, or trying to measure well-being in schools. It's one of those things, it's very difficult to measure, isn't it? But the Learning for Wellbeing project, which was called Measure What Matters and is now called What Makes Me Me, I think, that they're working with, Martin Rawson is working with them, and X-Way. So there are projects afoot.
Because in the background, my question is, for Waldorf schools, of course, this should be the measurement we do, as Christoph said. So how is teaching, how is the school affecting the well-being of the children in Waldorf schools? Is this really, do they have a good school atmosphere around them? That should be our measurement. And if it's done something like that, maybe it would be interesting to have a measurement which can be compared in Waldorf schools during the years. But of course, it would be a wonderful measurement if it could be compared to other schools.
Absolutely. We have in the assessment system that we recommend to our schools, we have something called the Human Values Framework, which is it's about exactly that. I will try and remember to share it, but that looks at we actually do have that measurement in early years in England, in mainstream education. It's called the Characteristics of Effective Learning, and it's about how children learn rather than about what they learn. And we used some of that language to create our Human Values Framework. So it's about resilience, persistence, confidence, happiness, and what that looks like in the classroom.
Yes,
the last bit of research I just wanted to share very quickly is the really positive thing around that wait for getting help. The research also shows that 80% of successful mental health care is done by 20% of the practitioners, and well-trained teachers can have an equivalent impact on children's mental health, an equivalent positive impact on children's mental health as successful therapy.
Just one more mention. I see Sven wants to say something, because I think that could be something we can bring out of the Waldorf perspective, something like that, and do a measurement. And there could be a strong political, I really mean political argument about it, because out of the values of our time, of course, it has an enormous economical influence for what's going on in later life. If they have a good career, if they need treatment or life or whatever. So that could be a good argument to have Waldorf schools, because it's not our aim, but this is how our society works. There is an economical effect in the end, how they have their childhood.
Absolutely.
May I add another point?
Of course.
Yeah. I do not know how it is in the UK, but here on the continent, we have an enormous lack on teachers.
Yeah.
Nearly no one wants to become teacher anymore. And we always ask why that is. And the method-driven style of teaching today, where the teacher is not so important, but mostly, but what is important is how the children follow a certain method. So we experience that as a huge devaluation of the teacher's personality. And there, I guess the effect of that is no one wants to become a teacher, especially in primary schools.
Yeah.
How is that in the UK?
We have a massive teacher recruitment and retention crisis. I think we're up to 1 in 3 teachers leaves in their first 5 years. It's
So
and that's across Waldorf
same.
education as well as. And I'm just going to put the link. Magda asked a question in the chat about how to manage your own mental health and well-being. And I apologise that it's an Amazon link. It was the quickest way to find it. But I've just put a link to a book which is called "Why Has Nobody Told Me This Before?" And that's the best resource I've come across for teachers.
Okay, interesting.
Sven, you had your hand up. Sorry.
We can't hear you,
Can't
Sven.
hear you.
Yeah, I think this should be better. Is that okay? Before you mentioned the human values framework, I was going to mention the fact that I learned this from you. And I actually teach it to schools in the UK, but also increasingly abroad now. And I just wanted to give you a brief glimpse of what it looks like, because there's something better about it than I've seen any other system. So I'm just going to quickly share that. You don't have to read all the writing, but the point of this is that you can use it for every pupil in every subject of every age in your school. And it's such an incredibly Waldorf way of judging engagement and the quality of healthy engagement of the pupils. And this is not that important in terms of what it looks like right now, but this is all it is. It's just 3 pages. So it's relatively quick to explain. And I've also recently, Kath doesn't know this yet, but I've translated it into German and presented it at the big summer conference last year. And those teachers were amazed in Germany that you could do something like this, that measures engagement and creates positive data about the well-being of pupils. So this is worth spending some time on. And I don't know what way we have to raise the profile of this, but certainly all the schools in other countries like in Asia that have adopted this, they're all extremely happy to apply it.
Nicolina?
Yes, thank you very much. I was thinking about what you have been saying in your lecture, and this is something that is really present in the society, in the consciousness, especially I would say in the consciousness of the new generation of the parents. So what we have perceived also without our school community is that there is an increase of going to the other extreme in order to prevent the child to experience any kind of trauma. The parents go into extreme protectiveness, really taking them out of the chance to experience even this youth stress that you have also talked about. So this is also something that has to go into the equation, and to see, so that we can see how this pendulum is actually dancing around, and how it also affects this point of teachers just quitting, because here you have the system who is promoting completely something opposite, this rigor with stress, and then you have the parents which are trying to prevent any kind of stress with the children. So is there any research that is being done also on this side?
It's the research is around emotional intelligence and resilience. building resilience. And the way that we build resilience is by facing challenges and overcoming challenges. I gave a talk to parents recently on exactly this, because that was the group of parents who were really struggling with the idea that their children would be challenged in any way at all. And I think we, in Waldorf education, I find it really interesting. We are very, very happy to challenge children physically. We're happy for them to climb trees and take risks and push themselves physically. We're happy to challenge them in handwork. We're happy to challenge them in doing different crafts and really challenging, metalwork and woodwork. We're happy to challenge them to learn a musical instrument, to learn 2 languages. And then in the UK, we shy away from challenging them academically. So that there is a midpoint that sits between this knowledge-based curriculum where it's cram as much information in as you possibly can, and don't ever ask them to strive academically for anything. And we need to keep our parents informed. And the thing that I found most helpful is to work with parents on what helps and give them the things that they can do. Yeah. And the wrapping language around experiences is a really, really helpful one. There's a guy called Dan Hughes who's done some fantastic work on this, PACE. There's a load of stuff around empathy. Lots of the reading in those references on that PDF will be helpful, I think.
Thank you so much. But also it's what we have seen is not only this academic side that they are preventing them, but also, you have so many parents that are so scared to let the child go from the parents, to be away from the parents, to climb the trees, for God's sake, So it is going into these physical also challenges, which children are being prevented for.
And even the micro challenges, like putting your own coat on when you're little, and serving your own breakfast and being able to cook, all of those kinds of things.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions? I think my message to take away is that in Waldorf education, there are a lot of things that we do. There are a lot of protective factors that we provide and a lot of things that we do really well, but we also have a lot to learn, and we should be at the forefront of this. We should be doing this better than anybody else. We've got a head start, but it's still, there's a lot of work to do. We need to be really researching and being very aware of what we can do better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, people are asking for the human values framework. If you email me, I can email it to you. I think I've got an explanation of it somewhere as well. I can send it through.
Yeah, it would be wonderful. Thank you. Yeah. Great.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, it's a lot of input. Yeah.
Yes, I apologize. It's a bit it's quite a lot to take in one go.
Yeah. But that movie you showed at the end, basically that should be the moral position of every teacher, to take care of all his or her students in this way. Yeah.
Absolutely. We should all be Mr. Pigden to somebody.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah. Yeah, it was very nice. Okay. Yeah.
I would be interested, Kath, if I may ask, what is your job at Sheffield Hallam University? So are you a full-time lecturer there, or what are you doing there?
So I work 1 day a week at Sheffield Hallam and 4 days a week for the Steiner Waldorf Schools Fellowship in the UK. So I'm part-time at Sheffield Hallam, and I teach postgraduate teacher education.
Okay, and the both institutions knows that you work in both, so Sheffield is aware of your Waldorf background?
Absolutely. Sheffield Hallam University is actively recruiting Steiner Waldorf kindergarten teachers onto their teacher education programs, because they get the best marks of any students.
Oh, wonderful.
I'm
Great.
so proud of my kindergarten graduates.
Yeah, in kindergarten it starts. Yep.
Yeah. I gave my first ever 96%, which is the top mark that you can possibly score. I gave my first ever 96% last year to a Waldorf kindergarten teacher.
Wonderful. Good. Good. Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done in the UK school movement, Waldorf school movement. Yeah,
definitely.
They have to go a long way. Yeah. So wonderful that you do that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, there has been a question about the sheet of paper you presented, Sven, if this could be available for others too.
This is the same that Kath was talking about.
Okay, I see. Okay, and you
took it further to take it into schools, but
yeah.
I've actually had the experience that it's worthwhile spending 20 minutes explaining it to the teachers. It works better than just reading people, but than reading it does. But that's maybe something that can be organized.
You can provide a YouTube around it, so it can be spread with a YouTube.
Kath and I have history in that, so maybe we can do something like that together. Yes.
Done that before, haven't we, Sven? Yeah.
Yes.
Dirk has a question.
Just a comment. Thanks, Kathy. And yeah, I think what you said, the last things that there's so much experience in the whole society meanwhile, and especially what I see here in Germany, the whole society is aware of this problem in one way or the other, because the abused children, they are victims right in the beginning, but they might become perpetrators later on. And so when we don't do something for the children, we enhance maybe the problems for the society later on. And there's so much experience in the society that we should encourage each other, not only to stick to Waldorf colleagues, but also to see, like what you mentioned, to meet other, whatever, psychologists and so on. And here in Germany, each school region has psychologists only for schools, because we have these problems in all schools now. And it comes up more and more how many abused children are in the schools. And we had a lot of measurements going on before Corona and after Corona. And we saw such an increase during the Corona time because the children had to stay at home. And there are many people aware of that. And there are many nice tools that we can help not only the children, but also the teachers, how to treat these children. Because like as a teacher, more or less each single day you can run, even also in Waldorf schools, you can meet a child, and when you have some sort of a good relationship to this child, you will hear all sorts of stories of all sorts of abuse going on at home. And yeah, there are also in Waldorf schools, there are so many children we can help each day, and there are so many tools available. So I think that was very important what how you finished your talk, that you said, well, yeah, let's go on and try to be as good as possible. Let's improve ourselves and all the skills we need for this trauma sort of curing. And also, you know, that there's this special treatment developed by the Waldorf movement to how to treat traumatized little kids, and there some teachers go all over the world and travel to certain regions and try to help these traumatized children. So yeah, many things we can learn from each other. And so thanks for your data. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dirk. Yes, I think we have to finish a couple of minutes. Laura, are you going to announce some kind of a evaluation sheet you want to present next time, something like that?
Yes, sure, of course. So we thought that it would be nice to have some sort of feedback from all of you to see how you experienced this year's lecture series, and also to see what we could improve, or also the topics that you are still interested in that we could perhaps incorporate next year. And yeah, so we plan on providing you with this survey approximately next week to Paula Blackman's lecture. Yes, exactly. I think that's it so far. Thanks.
Yeah. So this will be the situation. We would like to continue with this International Campus Waldorf. And so we're going to start the next session next autumn. And so it would be nice to get your input. What could be, how could be done better? And are there persons you would recommend to invite? Other topics you would like to address? So give us some ideas for planning the next session next year. And so we start with this next time. And you have a couple of days maybe to send it back to us. So, Kath, thank you very, very much that you gave us that wonderful talk. That was really very much knowledge you gave us, and all this overview. I really got the experience. You're totally an expert in your topic, and it's wonderful to see this and bring this to us. And even in the situation that you're in the state of recovering from your COVID disease. So thank you so much. You did it for us today. And next week we will have Paula Blackman from Alanus University with us, a colleague of mine, and she speaks about Unblack the Box. So this will be about media education. She has done a lot of research about media education, and she is developing some kind of a program how to do media education in an appropriate way in Waldorf schools. And this will be the topic next week. Have a good evening, have a good day, have a good night, whatever, where you are. And have a good week in front of you, and looking forward to see you all again next week on Tuesday, together with Paula Blackman. Thank you, Kath.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And all the best for your health.
Thank you.
Thank you.